Okay, APUS history students, this is our first national review. We're going to be taking a look at the period from the New Republic up to Manifest Destiny. You might be wondering really quick, just to get this out of the way, why aren't we dealing with the stuff beforehand? Well, there's not a ton of stuff on there on the test, national exam, so we will do a little bit of stuff in class to get ready for that. But what I really want to focus in on right now is the New Republic up to Manifest Destiny, and then later on this week we're going to talk about Manifest Destiny up to the Civil War. So this gives us our first building blocks for how we are going to look at where the test is going and what you need to know for the beginnings of the test. So in order to start off, what are these key concepts? So a little bit of a new thing for us because of the way that I teach the class. Each one of the periods has what AP calls key concepts, and we've learned these during the year, but now I want to focus on them more specifically. Why? Well, this is the way the College Board basically organizes the class. And if we know these key concepts now, not word for word, but just in a general way, you can kind of guess at what the questions are going to ask for multiple choice and for essay questions because they tend to be worded off of these ideas. So the key concepts for the beginning of AP US history, especially this New Republic period, are the following. First off, the British attempted to assert more control over the colonists, which led to rebellion because it took away their self-governance. So that's key concept 3.1. So it's period 3, that's the way that they explain it, of the New Republic, and this is our first concept. The British were attempting to assert more control, took away colonist self-governance. Okay, so 3.2, so our second key concept. The American Revolution experimented with these new democratic and republican ideals, okay, and trying to form up their government. And then last up, key concept 3.3, migrations within North America led to conflicts over resources, boundaries, and trade. Now, if you think about this, go back to what we learned about this year. This is not that hard. I don't want you guys to memorize these key concepts word for word, but I want you to keep them in mind. So what we have here in the New Republic, we've learned about. The British policies led to a stealing of local governance. Okay, the American Revolution experimented with new ideas, like republican ideas, okay, representative government. And then last off, people started migrating, and that created new types of stresses and new types of conflicts. So this is stuff we've gone over. We're just putting it into specific wording. So at the very beginning of this time period, we have 3 new empires that are formed: New England, New France, and New Spain. Each one of these were formed under mercantilism, so remember, they're being formed for mercantile goals. Go out, get colonies for raw resources, bring them back to make finished products. Okay, this led to several different conflicts, but the most important we want to remember the French Indian War. Why? Because of the consequences of the French Indian War. At the end of the French Indian War, the British win, the French are gone. But the first big consequence was an immense war debt. The second was resolving conflicts with the Native American allies. And the third is that the king and the parliament needed to reassert their authority. So because of these mercantile wars, we start to see that key concept 3.1. The British start reasserting policies that basically take away local governance. Best examples of those. Okay, first of all, taxes. Mercantile wars led to immense debts. Britain had to pay off those debts. And so in order to pay off the debts, they started passing certain laws, or certain acts, like the Sugar Act, which really reinforced the Navigation Acts. It actually lowered taxes, but it reinforced the Navigation Acts and said you can only trade with Great Britain. The Stamp Act, which attempted to raise taxes on paper goods, and the Townshend Acts, which placed duties or tariffs on imports of tea, glass, and paper. And we also had restrictions on local assemblies. So here again, go back to that key concept, the idea being here that Britain was taking away local governance. And that's what angered the colonists so much. So the Townshend Acts, part of the reason why they raised tariffs was so that Parliament could start paying local governors' salaries. Well, why does that matter? Because in the past, colonies paid local governors' salaries. So now all of a sudden, you were having the Parliament do this. This removes local power. The Intolerable Acts, which were an attempt to address the Tea Party. The Intolerable Acts shut down local assemblies, removing that local governance. And then there were restrictions on movements for Americans. So this goes back to the dealing with Native American allies. The Proclamation of 1763, after the French and Indian War, did not allow American colonists to move into the Ohio River Valley because the British wanted to protect the areas of their Native American allies. This really angered American colonists who thought, hey, we just fought against these guys and you are giving them all of this land in the Ohio River Valley. So in the midst of all of these fights for local power, we have these new experiments in Republican government and Democratic government. The big ones that you need to remember are the following. John Locke's belief in natural rights. Remember, that's the belief in property, life, and liberty as being these things that are inherent to who we are. That leads into the social contract, the notion that the government is responsible to protect those, which means we are no longer we're no longer servants of the government. We are citizens who get to vote the government in or out based on whether or not they protect our rights. And then Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine argues even more so. I mean, this becomes a really powerful argument. In the midst of the American Revolution, he argues in the pamphlet Common Sense that the best way to achieve actual empowerment of the people is through local control. No longer should we be controlled by a government that's 3,000 miles away from us. So this leads into a colonial divide. You end up having multiple different groups who are siding with one of these experiments. So like the Patriots believe in a complete separation from the English king, establish a republic in which we vote upon citizens who are going to represent us. The Loyalists, who remain British, and they believe that they have to be loyal to the British and just have some compromises on issues of taxes and representation. Africans, who are seeking freedom from slavery, remember, the British are going to appeal to them, and a large number of them decide to go over because of the Dumbarton Proclamation. They decide to go fight for the British. And the natives, who kind of look on both sides, seeking out different alliances. So once the American Revolution is done, we now have an experimentation in how to establish our models of governance. And there are two possibilities. The first one is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was based upon an idea of empowering local people as much as possible. So Thomas Paine's idea, put everything into the states' rights as far as their power goes. In fact, in this kind of government, 9 of 13 states had to vote for laws at the federal level, and you have a unanimous vote for amendments, plus there needed to be voluntary taxation. All that's at the federal level, which means there is a centralized government, but it's very weak. The states had the most power. So because of that, we then have eventually a rebellion against this. Not violent rebellion, but a situation in which people come together in Pennsylvania and they form the Constitution. The Constitution, unlike the Articles of Confederation, is a federalist system, meaning it's a sharing of federal power and local power. Okay, so states and central government basically share power out. In order to do that, they want to make sure that the federal system is not so strong that it becomes a monarchy. So they separate out the powers between 3 branches. Also, the Electoral College, which was used for electing the executive, it's not direct elections. It's basically each state gets a certain amount of electoral representatives who are voted upon. The idea is that big states and small states would be balanced out between each other. Now, in the end, the truth is the Electoral College balanced out much more regions than it did states. So you had basically the North, alliances between big states and small states in the North, balanced out big states and small states in the South. And then last off, the anti-federalists were able to push through the idea of a Bill of Rights that would protect local states. So that becomes our federalist constitutional system and our experiment, okay, in the models of governance. Now, when all this is done, we have 2 major figures that we need to remember who really take that model afterwards and say, okay, at this point and then, now that we are a federalist system, how will we define the balancing of power? And our 2 are Hamilton and Jefferson. So Hamilton is with the Federalists. He wants to see as much power shifted towards the central government as possible. He believes in the natural aristocracy and that they will lead a manufacturing system that is going to make us competitive with England. In order to do this, the federal government should assume the state debts. The federal government should pay off those debts, allow us to become creditworthy, and that's going to attract foreign investment. And keep in mind, who are we talking about with foreign investment here? Well, we're really talking about industrial investors. We also should have excise taxes to help pay off those debts. Where are the excise taxes coming from? Well, they tend to be on things that are like alcohol related, like whiskey related. And because of that, that's going to primarily affect the farmers. And then last off, Hamilton believes in the national bank. Well, why? Well, the national bank is really meant to establish like firm credit in the country. But it also attracts creditors. Well, who is it attracting with foreign creditors? Well, it tends to attract industrialists. So notice what Hamilton again is doing here, trying to bring us over into an industrialized system. Jefferson, on the other hand, used to be the leader of the Anti-Federalists, now they become the Democratic Republicans. And the Democratic Republicans really push the idea of states' rights. So in their notion, we want to try and take away as much power from the federal government as possible and make it local. So it's back to the Thomas Paine idea. One of the ways he wanted to do this was through a strict construction of the Constitution, meaning read the Constitution literally if you're in the courts. Why? Because that way the Constitution restricts the federal government. And last off, he believes in the yeoman farmer of that farmer out in the woods, out in nature, taming the wilderness. But that's sort of the idealistic side. We also know the more realistic side, that a lot of these yeoman farmers are either owning slaves or see racial hierarchy as a way to protect their status in society. So in the midst of all this, after this is passed, we not only have the domestic side, we also have the foreign side, and we got to remember that. And the foreign side is established by Washington's Neutrality Proclamation. Remember, he says no long-term foreign entanglements. And why is he saying this at the time? Well, because of the Franco-American alliance. He wants to exit that alliance that we had promised France to abide by because France supported us during the American Revolution. But the problem for us at that time period is the French Revolution. Our fear is the French are going to drag us into this radical revolution. And on top of that, that they will drag us into fights with Great Britain. Because of that, we send out our Secretary of State, John Jay, who makes a backdoor treaty with Britain that says, hey, look, we're going to leave the Franco-American alliance. We want trade with you. And in the midst of all this, France begins demanding in what was known as the Quasi-War that we support them in the Caribbean. Now, keep in mind, at that point, Napoleon had taken over France. And the demand from France is that we support them in their war against Britain. So last off, this is now, once we get past this era, we start to enter into what's going to become the Western migrations. That's going to take us eventually into Manifest Destiny. Keep in mind how the War of 1812 plays such a huge role in this. When the War of 1812 ends, Americans have a much deeper sense of nationalism. And off of that, we get this proposal made by Henry Clay of what's called the American System, which was an attempt to unite the country based on new transportation investments by the government. So an example was that the federal system would invest into the Cumberland Highway, and that we would start using new technologies like the steamboat, the steamship, regional railroads, and the Conestoga wagon to move out west, unite the country. And this comes, of course, on the back of what was done in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, where settlers were beginning to move into Western territories that had been bought by Thomas Jefferson. Once that happens, the country dramatically changes. How so? Because of New Democracy. New Democracy was a movement before Andrew Jackson, but would eventually benefit Andrew Jackson, in which white males who moved out into all these territories started voting to get rid of property requirements for voting. And that, of course, causes people on the East Coast to do the same because they have to keep up. And so at that point now, we have white male suffrage throughout the country. But the expansion to North and South means, with this white male suffrage, that we're going to start seeing a growing regionalism over issues of slavery or representation in the Senate. So what are our takeaways that we can take from this? Well, remember our key concepts for period 3. Period 3 is a time in which America breaks away from Great Britain and starts forming its identity in nationalism. This began with that desire for independence due to tax policies and the tearing away of our local representation. Americans then began experimenting with new ideas like natural rights and the need for local representation and to have checks and balances on centralized power. The Constitution that was created was a shared system of governance between central and state governments. And then last off, very important, was what happened after the War of 1812. Once the War of 1812 is done, people began expanding out west. There's a growing sense of unity, but at the same time, as people expand out west and slavery expands out west, we're also going to see a growth in sectionalism and regionalism. So that takes us up in period 3 in this beginning of our time period, and then we'll continue with the story as we get into the next period leading up to the Civil War. Okay, I hope this helped to start getting you ready for that big AP exam that's coming up in about a month. We'll see you guys in class. Bye.